It is Monday, May 13th, 2024. Today we're going to talk about the 6 ways the Marvel president, Dan Buckley, either doesn't get it right or doesn't get it at all from his interview and presentation from the recent ComicsPRO business conference back in February. But before we get started, please like, share, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notification. Thank you very much for joining. I'm Gabe Hernandez, your publisher in the IC. That's out of the way. So what is ComicsPRO? ComicsPRO is a business conference, pretty dry stuff, pretty boring stuff, but you're not going to, but the publishers and the individuals who are responsible for creating comic books and want them to be sold by the comic shops go there to talk to the comic shop owners. It's a business to business conference. The publishers make the comics. The attendees are all comic shop owners, and they're the people responsible for selling the comics. By far, in the United States anyway, the largest channel for getting comic books in the hands of people, excluding digital, of course. So it's a very dry conference. You're not going to find cosplayers there. You're not going to find big flashy presentations or Hall H type setups where celebrities come on the stage and make some big pitch for the next MCU movie or DC movie. This is all about the business of making comics, the publishers making their presentations about what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong, what they're going to do in the future, and the comic shop owners hearing that and asking questions and trying to figure out, okay, how do I take what you're doing, position it in the market, and do the best to sell it? This interview that we're talking about and the keynote speech on which it's based is from Dan Buckley, who is the president of Marvel Comics. We're always talking about folks like Tom Brevoort and C.B. Cebulski and all the folks that are responsible for the day-to-day creation of Marvel Comics. But Dan Buckley is the president. He's the top. He's essentially the publisher. C.B. Cebulski reports to him. So whenever we're harping on the editors about making bad choices and doing the wrong thing, and why do we have a Blood Hunt crossover event that has 59 issues? Why are we doing limited runs that are 4 issues each? Why are we taking an existing run that's floundering and then rebooting with a new number 1 when everything else is the same, including the creative team? C.B. Cebulski might be making those creative strategic decisions, but Dan Buckley signs off on it. So when we say, why is Marvel messing up? The buck literally stops with Buckley. It just works out that way. I'm sorry, folks. Anyway, so what we did is we read through the interview. We read through the keynote speech that Dan Buckley gave, and this is all through ICV2. Links will be down in the description. And we said, let's look at all the salient points. What are the big major talking points is he really addressing if you cut out all the fluff and the ums and ahs, of which I'm guilty of as well? And what are the major direction and strategic talking points? And how do they compare against the golden rule? Now, if you follow this channel for any period of time, you know we harp on the golden rule all the time, which is you give customers what they already want, where they already are, at a fair price. 1, 2, 3. Take the speech, take the interview, hold it up to the light of the golden interview. Does it stand up? The answer is some parts do, but there are 6 major talking points where maybe not so much. And that's why we want to talk about that, because we understand the person who's in charge of Marvel is making these decisions. And if he's not adhering to the golden rule of making sure you're making the best product and selling the most of the best product possible, that's a red flag, and we need to talk about that. So the links to the full transcript, which we're not going to read, we're just going to talk about the points that we figured out by comparing the two, and then let's get to it. Point number 1, the limited focus on customer acquisition. Dan Buckley made a very big deal about reestablishing the concept of a Wednesday warrior, about bringing older readers back. And I don't mean necessarily older in age, I'm sort of getting up there, but older in the sense that people who have, at least in the past, habitually bought comics on a regular basis, weekly basis. They're not coming back in the same numbers that they used to pre-pandemic and even older. A lot of emphasis was placed on the pandemic throwing everything off. It certainly did that. But was that really the only major problem that's not bringing Wednesday Warriors back? Not really. And here's exactly what he says. It's always easier to sell to people who want to buy right away than to convert a new customer. And again, he's speaking to the comic shop owners. We're going to work on both, but we need to get people back. A lot of the speech was prioritizing getting the old readers back. The problem with that is it has very little focus, and throughout the course of the interview and the keynote speech, there's very little focus on understanding how we get the new readers in. The idea is to make your existing readers happy and then add new readers to that. A lot of the emphasis is placed on bringing the old readers back, but not a lot of emphasis on what we're doing to bring the new readers in to join the old readers as a growing community. So that's problem number one. Number two, over-reliance on nostalgia. Here's this quote. The reappearance of bullpen bulletins, Deadpool surprises, and projects like Uncle Scrooge and the Infinity Dime by Jason Aaron. All good stuff. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those things, but they all appeal to older readers. People who have, for example, an affinity for Deadpool. People who have an affinity for the Infinity Gauntlet mixed with Scrooge McDuck, which is a weird combination, but okay. Newer readers have no idea who Scrooge McDuck is. If you talk to anybody who's in, say, the 9 to 18-year-old range, male or female, and you say Scrooge McDuck, there's 0% chance that you're going to get anybody excited about that. So they're talking about doing new things or twists on old things, but really that only appeal to the older audience, older meaning people who are familiar with those properties. And we're seeing a lot of that now. If you look at the broader picture, Image is having great success right now with the Energon universe, which is mixing Transformers and G.I. Joe. But that's something that appeals to the older readers who kind of grew up with the action figures and the cartoons. I remember I was there every day watching those cartoons at, I believe it was 3:30 or 4 o'clock. Transformers and G.I. Joe it was a double team. Or Dynamite, go over to Dynamite. You got Space Ghost, you got Thundercats, they're doing Johnny Quest, those kinds of things. Mad Cave is now releasing Flash Gordon. So there's a lot of this whole concept of bringing the old readers back, but they're doing it with properties that have absolutely no connection to the last generation or the current generation. Number three, no mention of a digital sales strategy. We looked in both the speech and the interview. There's almost nothing about digital. There's a brief comment or two, but as far as a direct point with emphasis and a strategy, there's nothing. Now, you do have the Marvel Unlimited app, but when you compare it against a much more successful and much more widely adopted Viz app for manga, you see the differences very clearly. They don't do day and date, which means they're releasing on digital at the same time they're releasing on print. The price point is significantly higher, and the reading experience is not always great because you can't find everything in the Marvel back catalog. And I know some people like the guided view where it zooms in on the individual panels as you're reading, but that makes the app more complicated. It makes it clunky sometimes. And if you look over at Viz, who has a much more popular app, they don't do any of that stuff. And yet there's this need to make something that should be simple, complicated, and expensive. Taking all that into account, Buckley covers none of that. He doesn't talk about anything related to digital strategy. Now, in fairness, he's talking to the comic shop owners. To be clear, there's no way around it. Digital is a direct competitor to the local comic shop. So there might be a reason why he didn't bring that up, but at the same time, he can't ignore it. And by not talking about it with the constituents that would be affected by it, all he's doing is running away from the problem. So that's no good. Number four, limited data on industry health. Now, this was brought up, but there's sort of lack of clarity about why that's a problem. On the surface, no data is a problem, but Marvel has their data, so they know what decisions they're making. The problem is if they're not sharing it. And so the question becomes, if they're not sharing their data, who's most impacted by that? Yes, the comic shop owners are impacted by that because if they see sales trends for a particular title going down, comic shop owners are now more informed and most likely will not buy that comic. So in effect, Marvel could be saying it's self-defeating. If I give you the numbers that show, so for example, Birds of Prey. Okay, I'm picking on Disney. If Birds of Prey is going down and the comic shop owners see that it's going down, well, they'll be less inclined to buy more issues of it because they know nobody wants it. So Marvel, in effect, is probably hiding those numbers for any of their titles because they realize if people see that the numbers are going down, A, that's more fodder for people like me. Sorry. But it helps inform the comic shop owners, which is what they want, but it might inform them in a way that Marvel doesn't want. So that kind of gives a disingenuous impression that I'm intentionally hiding the numbers so that you can't make an informed decision, because if you make an informed decision, it's against Marvel's best interest, which is shady. Number five, uncertain long-term impact of in-store gimmicks. So let's pick on Blood Hunt, which is the big event that just started technically the week before last, but really kicked into high gear last week. they're taking certain issues of the main comic event and they're making red band, more graphic, more gory versions of the story, and they're making that available only in comic shops. It's a gimmick. Since if you want the gorier version, the bloodier version, you got to go to the comic shop and buy it in the physical version in person at the shop. Now, on its surface, you might say, oh, well, that's great. I can go into the shop and the shop owners are saying, you're giving us an exclusive, something that they have to come here to get. That brings in foot traffic and they're more likely to see other things they may like and might buy other comics. On the surface, that's a good thing. The problem is, A, it's a gimmick, so it's not sustainable. B, if you've looked at the excerpts from the Red Band version, it almost creates, I would say, contradictions in the main story. So, for example, in Doctor Strange, the recent Doctor Strange issue, we now know that Doctor Strange is killed and turned into a vampire in the main comic that's available to everybody. But if you get the Red Band version, you see that he's basically cut in half and ripped apart, which doesn't make sense from a continuity perspective, because how can you be killed just enough and then be turned into a vampire if you're in pieces on the floor? So they're giving you a gimmick, but it's not a really consistent gimmick. And also, again, gimmicks are not sustainable. You can't just do a gimmick every single week. It's just not going to work. And plus, I think there's a higher price point too. So gimmicks are not sustainable. They're cute. They give you a little boost when you need it, maybe from a title that isn't getting enough attention, but it is not a sustainable model that you can build on and develop consistency with readers coming back over and over again. And then number 6, neglecting online leaks and piracy. So there's very little conversation about the impact and effects of piracy on the comic shops and on Marvel itself proper. Now, I won't say this, piracy is always bad. Nobody's arguing that piracy is bad. However, piracy is usually brought about by 3 factors. Factor number 1, people are cheap and lazy. There is nothing you're going to do to overcome that. It's just going to happen. People are cheap and lazy. So some people will steal because they believe it's a victimless crime and they're going to do it anyway. That portion of the audience you're never going to overcome. Number 2, the product that they want to buy, that they have money and they're willing to buy, is not readily accessible. That is on Marvel, because not every town has a comic shop. I am fortunate that around me, within reasonable driving distance, there's 2, which is nice. Some other towns, you get plenty, also nice. There are some towns and even countries where you can't find one within miles and miles and miles. I mean, we're talking like multiple hours worth of driving to get there. Not good. Now, is that Marvel's fault? Partly, because they don't have clarity about how you can get your hands on a comic if you don't have a shop near you. Now, that's not the comic shop's fault, that's Marvel's fault. Now, most people don't realize that Marvel still has their subscription service. You can order it by mail, but is it reliable? Do people even know about it? Is Marvel pushing it? Absolutely not. So again, Marvel wants to get their comics into the hands of as many people as possible, but they're making it hard to do that. So that's the second reason people pirate. The third reason people pirate is pricing. Marvel's cover pricing model right now is horrible. There is no way on earth for God's number 1, even though it's written by Jonathan Hickman, should cost, I think it was nearly $10 for a triple-sized story that really didn't tell you a whole lot and spent a lot on flashbacks and prologue. Pardon me. That doesn't make any sense. Their pricing model is out of whack with the economy. It's out of whack for what people are willing to buy. It's out of whack with the whole notion of establishing new readers. If you are curious about comics and you haven't been reading comics, and I walk in a comic shop and I see the average comic price is $4, $5, $6 for a character that I don't know, for storylines that I don't understand. X-Line, for example, is completely impenetrable to a new reader. That doesn't make sense. There has to be a happy medium that makes the introduction more sustainable, or at least not sustainable, it's not the right word, is more attractive to a new reader to get their feet wet, to dip their toe, to say, does this make sense? In this speech and interview, Buckley covers none of that, which is unfortunate. As far as those are the 3 areas that make piracy a viable option, But the reason he's not covering it most likely is that he's not giving any answers to how they're tackling piracy and how they're making the prospect of piracy seem less attractive, if not completely unattractive, to the average reader. Pardon me, sorry about that. Frog in my throat, don't want to start over, but you get the idea. Anyway, so that's it. 6 ways where Dan Buckley had the opportunity from a business to business perspective to address what Marvel is doing to make things better. And when you hold that speech and that interview up to the light of the golden rule, what they already want, where they already are, at a fair price, 6 ways that Dan Buckley completely misses the mark. Let me know what you think. Leave a comment down below. Let me know your thoughts. If you're reading this on Substack, please add a comment. If you're watching this on YouTube, please leave a comment. Or on your audio podcast player of choice, please leave a comment. And we're going to take a break right now, and we're going to move over to the rest of the newsletter. All right, moving back to our newsletter. Of course, our pick of the week is not a big surprise to anyone at all. It's Transformers number 8. I have to say I'm very pleased with how well Daniel Warren Johnson, Skybound, and Image have maintained consistency of quality on this title. This issue probably didn't hit as hard as some of the prior ones, but generally speaking, it was a great issue. And the changeover from Daniel Warren Johnson to Jorge Corona on art duties didn't really miss a beat. The styles are different, it's noticeable, but at the same time, it still works. So very happy with this title overall. Moving over to reviews, the links are in the newsletter. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe down below. It's free. Happy to have you along. Let's take a look at what's going on for next week. So you may have noticed the thumbnail is a little different because we're doing something new. We're putting previews of the forthcoming reviews that we're going to write in video format, and we're posting those. We're going to try to do that, say, Friday afternoons, roughly. So the thumbnail is a little different to be consistent with the for the forthcoming reviews. Hopefully you'll like it, and we'll see how that works out. So let's talk about a big week we got coming up. We have Biggs and Tiny number 2 from Black Box. We have Sanction number 1 and When the Blood Has Dried number 2, both from Mad Cave. Those are supposed to be done last week. Scheduling conflict, we'll get them done this week. We have Oz, Fall of the Emerald City number 2 from Zenescope. Faith Returns from Valiant, and which was supposed to be done last week, but now this week. And Exo Man of War Invictus number 1, which is new, also from Valiant. We have big week from Image. Ain't No Grave number 1 and The Sacrifices number 9. That was last week into this week. New this week, we have G.I. Joe Real American Hero number 306. Red Coat number 2. That's from the Ghost Machine imprint. Fish Flies number 6. Jeff Lemire. Rat City number 2, which is the cyberpunk future version of Spawn in an alternate dimension. Spawn number 353, and Monolith number 1. Monolith is the Monolith character from the Spawnverse, spun off into a small miniseries. Big week for Image. Red Sonja, Empire of the Damned number 2 from Dynamite, last week into this week. And then we have the Devil Tree number 3 and Gun Honey Collision Course number 1, which is a new Gun Honey miniseries from Titan Comics. So that's it. That's our review for this week, or not our review, our newsletter for this week. Thank you very much for joining. Please leave a comment about your thoughts about Marvel's presentation at ComicsPRO and the Dan Buckley interview. We want to know what you think about that. And that's going to help us inform what we talk about in the future, because your opinion matters. Gabe Hernandez, your publisher in EIC for Comical Opinions. Thank you very much for joining. Please stay tuned through the outro for the next video.